Also wenn wir schon über Avantgarde sprechen, mache ich jetzt einen Tabubruch. Ich mische Cola Light mit Wasser. Das ist vielleicht die letzte Möglichkeit von Transgression in der Geschichte der Avantgarde, Cola Light mit Wasser zu mischen. Ich hatte ja bis gestern oder bis vor einer Stunde das Gefühl, dass ich weiß, was Avantgarde ist, und habe gestern viel über Avantgarde und dann noch über die Après-Garde Bolaño gesprochen. Dadaismus, Surrealismus, Situationismus. Jetzt habe ich mich dummerweise daran erinnert, dass ich keine Ahnung von Avantgarde habe. Das hat mich nämlich Tom McCarthy einmal gelernt oder gelehrt. Ich war vor langer Zeit mal im Literaturclub irgendwie als Moderator tätig. Bei den ersten Sendungen hatte ich immer so heimlich hier unten 2 Bücher versteckt und habe immer gedacht, wenn das sehr langweilig wird in der Sendung, dann komme ich jetzt mit einem richtigen Skandal. Und habe immer gedacht, ich würde dann diese beiden Bücher hochhalten und sagen, das war damals gerade ein Bestseller von Martin Suter, Die Zeit, die Zeit. Und dann hätte ich gesagt, der Plot und fast alle Motive sind geklaut aus einem nicht so Bestsellerbuch, sondern aus einem Longseller von Tom McCarthy, nämlich 8,5 Millionen. Und dann hätte ich das lange beschrieben. Dieses Buch von Tom McCarthy, 8,5 Millionen, wurde von verschiedenen Verlagen anfangs der Nullerjahre abgelehnt, kam dann 2005 raus, wurde eben das, was man einen Longseller nennt, sehr bekannt, gerade auch in den Kreisen der Kunst, wurde verfilmt 2015. Und es erzählt eigentlich eine einfache Geschichte von jemandem, der aus unerfindlichen Gründen erwacht und kein Gedächtnis mehr hat. Und unter der Bedingung, dass er nicht herausfindet oder herausfinden will, was ihm passiert ist, kriegt er 8,5 Millionen Pfund. Deshalb der deutsche Titel, Reminder heißt das Buch in Englisch. Und da geht er so durchs Leben und hat, wie wir alle, oft das Gefühl, man lebt nur ein Secondhand-Leben. Man zündet die Zigarette falsch an, wenn man überhaupt noch rauchen darf. Darf ich ja auch nicht mehr. Und wenn man den Kühlschrank öffnet in der Nacht, ist es auch irgendwie wie ein schlechter Schauspieler in einer schlechten Fernsehaufzeichnung und eben nicht wie Robert De Niro, der das so machen kann, dass es sich richtig echt anfühlt. Und so lebt er, wie wir alle, ein Leben im Unauthentischen. Und bei einer Party plötzlich sieht er den Riss in der Wand auf einer Toilette, zeichnet diesen Riss ab, der gibt ihm das Gefühl von Existenz, von Wirklichkeit, Wahrheit. Und dann fällt ihm rund um diesen Riss ein, wie ein Zimmer, eine Wohnung, letztlich ein Haus aussehen könnte, wo er einmal war, wo er wieder zu sich kommen könnte. Und mit den 8,5 Millionen Pfund heuert er dann Filmteams und Leute an, die in diesem Haus wohnen, Schauspieler auf der anderen Seite der Straße, Leute, die Katzen runterwerfen im richtigen Augenblick, damit sie hinter der Glasscheibe so verschlieren. Und jemand muss Leber brutzeln. Und tatsächlich kommt er so ganz kurz in das Gefühl, er ist bei sich. Und das wird dann immer weiter getrieben in Unfällen, Banküberfällen und am Schluss in einer Flugzeugentführung, wo das Flugzeug endlos in einer Acht ewig sozusagen, bis das Benzin ausgeht.
Mit so einem kleinen Rauchstock, die halb nebenan
Ja. Reisen muss. Und es ist sozusagen das Ende der Avantgarde im absoluten Terrorakt. Ich muss jetzt nicht erzählen, was bei Martin Suter der Plot ist, aber genau gleich. Also jemand baut etwas nach mit einem Filmteam. Es brutzelt auch Leber und Eigelb und es sind also die Markierungen am Boden und dort, um zurückzufinden in einen alten Moment, 20 Jahre vorher an einem bestimmten Tag. Und dann habe ich das Tom erzählt und also im Fernsehen habe ich es nie erzählt. Habe ich es ihm erzählt und gedacht, jetzt bin ich sein bester Freund und er wird eine Klage einreichen. Und das ist das Schlimmste, ich wurde abgeschrieben, man hat mich beklaut. Und dann hat er so wie jetzt gelächelt, so wie eine britische Sphinx. Das ist Ihnen offenbar völlig egal, wenn man etwas stiehlt, wenn man etwas von jemand anderem repetiert, übernimmt.
Ich glaube an der Originalität gar nicht. Also alles ist Wiederholung. I'm going to speak in English. It's better. I mean, the Übersetzerin can express me much better than me. I didn't invent repetition. You know, it's already in Shakespeare. Hamlet reenacts the murder of his father in front of the entire court. And this brings down the political order, not the murder of the king, but the repetition of the secret event. I think it's a long-standing theme in literature, but I'd say the borders between tribute, influence, plagiarism, détournement are very difficult to state with precision. So, and this is something I have explored quite a lot in my work, especially in the work on Tintin, actually.
Ja, natürlich eines meiner Lieblingsbücher, so erklärt die Literatur und die schwierigsten Literaturtheoretiker wie Roland Barthes anhand von Tim und Struppi und der Sängerin Castafiora, die irgendetwas in der Stimme hat, so ein bisschen wie ich jetzt, aber bei mir ist es eine Sinusitis, bei ihr ist es möglicherweise die Kastration. Also jedenfalls ein sehr verspielter Zugang zur Literatur. Was ich einfach nicht verstehe, wenn Sie davon ausgehen, dass alles ja auch letztlich eben Repetition ist. Ich meine, weshalb kommen Sie dann auf den Monte Verita?
What was the question?
Why you are coming to the Monte Verita? I mean, if there's no verity.
There's a very interesting history here of, in fact, Isadora Duncan and Rudolf Laban were both kind of characters in my last book, or not characters, but figures in the constellation of that book. I'm very interested in social groupings and cultural groupings, which is why we have here a picture of the surrealists with Breton on my right, your right too. And I thought maybe it might be interesting to start with, I mean, we all know what the surrealists said, but I think it's interesting to think of the way in which they said it, and this move away from the individual genius who expresses himself usually, to the group, you know, that it can be a group dynamic. This is something I have also stolen and repeated. So this is the meeting of the first committee of my International Neuronautical Society in front of a futurist painting meeting in London. This is the same photo released, 2 years later. Sorry, we've gone very far forwards. This is the same photo released 2 years later after we expelled and denounced half the committee. The woman at the front is Frances Hugh Pritchard, who would go on to represent New Zealand at the Venice Biennale. The man in the back, who looks like Wittgenstein, is Alex Hamilton, a prominent Australian artist. Because something that I find quite interesting with the surrealists is that they weren't a democratic group. They were very autocratic. There's something, I mean, Breton was a dictator. There's something of almost the kind of reminiscent of, you know, communist committees, but also of the far right in America. This is the McCarthy Un-American Activities Committee, and this is, again, we appropriated this format in 2003 when we held committee hearings into the relationship between radio and art, or technology and avant-gardes. And this actually led up, this was in the, this is at the Tate Modern, when our declaration on inauthenticity, when Simon Critchley, the philosopher, and I would make these press statements like a political kind of declaration, but we started sending actors, because it's more inauthentic to send actors. And then in the Taipei Biennial, we sent Chinese actors, a man and a woman speaking Chinese, so it's obviously not us. But in a way, the most, this is another appropriation. I'm just trying to kind of think about the logic of stealing, using cultural history as a kind of found object, because even if we think about surrealism, we can't think of it in isolation. We have to think about the way they stole or détourned or reenacted Dada and Futurism, and then afterwards, the lettrists and the situationists. But the most ambitious project, this was the manifesto as well, the art manifesto as a form of literature I find very, very interesting, especially Marinetti, actually, even more than Breton. And here we faked with Photoshop our own manifesto in the Times newspaper, just as Marinetti did the Futurist manifesto in Le Figaro, but we didn't have £1 million pounds or £20,000 to buy space in the Times. But once you fake it and put it in the archive, journalists will report that it was in the Times. In fact, even a journalist from the Times reported that 3 years later, said their manifesto was published in the Times. They didn't even check their own newspaper. And I guess our most ambitious project, and this is where we come to the theme of magnetic resonance, we did this radio project from the Institute of Contemporary Arts in London that again was very much a repetition of a moment in Jean Cocteau's film Orpheus, where a dead poet, Segeste, paid for by the Princess of Death, who funds the art magazines, he transmits these short poems over the radio to Orpheus, who picks them up on his car radio, and then he publishes them, he repeats them. I think it's a very interesting way of thinking about literature, not as the original expression of one person, but rather as a kind of repetition loop through a mediated kind of network of technology. So we set up this radio station, which was also kind of taking the ideas of William Burroughs about cutting up media, mixing today's sports results with lines from Ovid and Shakespeare, and generating these kind of short poems, these kind of surrealist fragments that were transmitted around London and, in fact, around the world. With other collaborating stations. And this was later repeated at the Museum of Modern Art in Stockholm, but there were no humans. It was only an aeroplane black box sending out the signals to the Stockholm area. But anyhow, I thought that might be a good place just to start to to bring us to the idea of radio and repetition.
Nun, wenn es ja keine Wahrheit gibt, sondern eben alles schon in einer Repetition ist, in einer Wiederaufnahme, Reenactment, und offenbar der einzelne Autor in dieser Gruppe aufgehoben ist und die Gruppe wiederum mit Radiowellen und magnetischen Wellen verbunden ist, mit allen anderen Einflüssen, dann ist eben die Frage, wer schreibt dann einen Text?
Ja.
Ich meine, Martin Sutter offenbar schon, aber vielleicht auch nicht. Oder vielleicht haben Sie den Roman von Sutter schon geschrieben und Ihr Roman wurde auch schon geschrieben von den Situationisten und Surrealisten. Ich meine, diese Auflösung, ist das nicht... Sie erzählen das jetzt recht lustvoll mit diesen Organisationen und so, aber... Ist es nicht unangenehm, wenn man das Gefühl hat, man schreibt gar nicht selber?
Yeah, this is a good question. Who writes? I mean, this is the question. For Roland Barthes, the answer is language. Language writes me. I don't write language. Language writes me. We are. To write is not to be the originator of a signal. It is to be, perhaps, this is the way I'd look at it. This is why I'm fascinated with Cocteau's Orpheus. Because the poet is not the one who originates the signal. The poet is the one who tunes into many signals which are already repetition pieces and somehow synthesizes it, modulates it, curates it, remixes it. We could use all these metaphors into some kind of form, which is a provisional form, and the poet then signs it, but not really in a sense that this is mine. This is just a stamp, a Zeitstamp.
Also Raoul Schott hat uns ja vorher erzählt, Wir sind hier auf dem Monte Verità und das geht zurück eben bis zu Moses, der auf den Berg der Wahrheit steigt und herunterkommt, und das wiederum geht zurück auf andere Berge, wo die Griechen hochgingen, und dort war dann ein Orakel, das die Wahrheit erzählt, und das geht natürlich auch auf die Vorstellung zurück, eben, dass es ein Medium gibt, ein Orakel, das die Wahrheit erzählt. Und gerade die Surrealisten haben mit Hypnose, Schlaf ja auch immer wieder an diese Medien geglaubt, haben gedacht, sie seien selber ein Medium. Ich habe mal in der Bibliothek Dusse so die Aufzeichnungen von Robert Desnos in der Hypnose auf die Frage, was ist Dada, gesehen. Da hat er geschrieben, Dada, das sind ein paar übrig gebliebene Bananen. Also der hat dann schon auch irgendwie die Wahrheit über den Dadaismus gesagt. Es ist letztlich natürlich auch ein Produkt, was man wie Bananen verkaufen kann. Aber ja, es ist auch dort natürlich ein bisschen die Frage, dieses spielerische Aufgehobensein in der Gruppe schützt sie natürlich vor dieser letztlich Todeserfahrung. Wenn man nicht der Autor seines eigenen Textes ist, dann ist man ja auch tot.
The author is tot? That was the question.
Meine, Sie haben ja eine internationale Sekte für nekronautische Studien betrieben. Ich meine, leben Sie gerne als Untoter?
This is what I like in this Cocteau film, this relation between a liminal space between death and life, or one form of death and another. It resonates for me very closely with the thinking of another surrealist associate, Maurice Blanchot, for whom literature is very intimately related with death. It's a form of, not of recovering death, but of dying, this kind of sein zum Tod, right? It's an eternal kind of drifting into this borderland in which the individual no longer has the power to master thoughts, but there's some kind of other relation. I mean, in my novel C, which really came out of this radio project, I stage it, and it's interesting you talk about oracles and mediums, because I still kind of believe in this slightly mediumistic relation with some kind of temple of truth or mountain of truth, but I don't believe in metaphysics. I believe in the poetry of the material networks and infrastructures of our life. So in this, I mean, maybe I should read the first passage that that we selected and that you have here. You have to imagine there's a 15-year-old boy or maybe 14, in 1911, and he's made a radio set. And if you listen to the radio in 1911, there were no national broadcasters. There were ships talking to ships, ships talking to shore, the British Empire talking to its outposts, and the higher up you go, the noise of, Geräusch, the cosmos. And you don't get words, you get clicks. A long click is a dash, and a short click is a dot. So the boy, they were usually boys, sitting at the radio, would listen, write the clicks, then translate into words. So it's very similar to this kind of mediumistic or automatic writing we could think of. And then they would have a long kind of text, which it strikes me would look very much like an Ezra Pound poem or a surrealist automatic writing. And the question is, as you say, who is the author? And maybe it's not an interesting question. I mean, maybe the question is, what is the content? So I'll read this passage. I will read this passage, and you can read it in the beautiful German translation. The German is really good. I think that makes me embarrassed. Okay. The static is like the sound of thinking, not of any single person thinking, nor even a group thinking collectively. It's bigger than that, wider and more direct. It's like the sound of thought itself, its hum and rush. Each night when Serge drops in on it, it recoils with a wail, then rolls back in crackling waves that carry him away all rudderless until his finger, nudging at the dial, can get some traction on it all, some sort of leeway. The first stretches are angry, plaintive, sad, and always mute. It's not until, hunched over the potentiometer among fraying cords and soldered wires, his controlled breathing an extension of the frequency of air he's riding on, he gets the first quiet clicks that words start forming. First, he jots down the signals as straight graphite lines, long ones and short ones. Then below these, he begins to transcribe curling letters, dim and grainy, in the arc light of his desktop. Tonight, as on most nights, he starts out local, sweeping from 250 to 400 meters. It's the usual traffic, CQ signals from experimental wireless stations in Macedown and Ellery, tapping out their call signs and then slipping into Q code once another bug, a bug means a radio enthusiast, once another bug has responded. Serge moves up to 500 meters. Here are stronger, more decisive signals, coastal stations' call signs flung from towering masts. Poldu is transmitting its weather report. A few nudges away, Malin, Cleethorpes, Nordyke send out theirs. Liverpool is exchanging messages with tugboats in the Mersey. Serge transcribes a rota of towing duties for tomorrow. Further out, the lightship Tongue is reporting a derelict's position. The coordinates click their way into the Seaforth station, then flash out again to be acknowledged by Marconi operators of commercial liners, one after the other. The ship's names reel off in litany: Falaba, British Sun, Scania, Morea, Carmania. Each name appendaged by its church: Cunard Line, Allen, Aberdeen Direct, Canadian Pacific Railway, Holland, America. The clicks peter out and Serge glances at the clock. It's half a minute before 1. A few seconds later, Paris's call sign comes on, FL for Eiffel. Serge taps his finger on the desktop to the rhythm of the huge tower's standby clicks, then holds it still and erect for the silent lull that always comes just before the time code. All the operators have gone silent, boats, coastal stations, bugs, all waiting, like him, for the quarter-second dots to set the air, the world, time itself back in motion as they chime the hour. They sound, and then the headphones really come to life. The press digest goes out from Niton, Poldu, Malin, Cadiz, Diario dell'Atlantico, Journal de l'Atlantique, Atlantic Daily News. Madero and Suarez shot in Mexico while trying to escape. Trade pact between Entretien de shocking domestic tragedy in Beau. Il Fondatore, husband unable to prevent. The stories blur together. Serge sees a man clutching a kitchen knife, chasing a politician across parched earth, past cacti and armadillos, while ambassadors wave papers around fugitive and pursuer negotiating terms. Malin has got 10 private messages for the ship Lusitania, 7 for Campania, 2 for Olympic. Request instructions how to proceed with the honor of your company on the occasion of weighing 7.5 pounds, a girl. Serge transcribes for a while, then lays his pencil down and lets the sequences run through the space between his ears, sounding his skull. There is a fluency to them, a rhythm that's spontaneous, as though the clicks were somehow speaking on their own and didn't need the detectors, keys, or finger-twitching men who cling to them like afterthoughts. He climbs to 600 and picks up ice report sent out from whaling ships. Floberg Growler 5 in 10 45 63, latitude 36W 12 39.37, longitude. Field ice 59N 42 43.54, latitude 14W 45 56.25, longitude. Compagnie de Télégraphie Sans Fil reports occasional light snow off Friesland. Paris comes on again. Again the cycle pauses and restarts. Then Bergen, Crookhaven, Tarifa, Malaga, Gibraltar. Serge Pictures gardenia flowers tucked behind girls' ears, red dresses and the blood of bulls. He hears news forwarded via Port Said and Rome from Abyssinia and sees an African girl strumming on some kind of mandolin. Suez is issuing warnings of Somali raiders further down the coast. More names process by Isle of Perim, Zanzibar, Isle of Socotra, Persian Gulf. Parades of tents line themselves up for him. Inside them, dancers serving sherbet. Outside, camels saddled with rich carpets. Deserts opening up beneath red skies. The air is rich tonight, still and cold, high pressure, the best time of year. Above 650 meters, the clicks dissipate into a thin, pervasive noise like dust. Discharges break across this, distant lightning, aurora borealis, meteorites. Their crashes and eruptions sound like handfuls of buckshot thrown into a tin bucket or a bucket full of grain-rich gravy dashed against a wash boiler. Wireless ghosts come and go, moving in arpeggios that loop, repeat, mutate, then disappear. Serge spends the last half hour of each night up here among these pitches, nestling in their contours as his head nods towards the desktop and lights flash across the insides of his eyelids, pushing them outwards from the center of his brain, so far out that the distance to their screen seems infinite. They seem to contain all distances, envelop space itself, curving around it like a patina, a mold. Once, he picked up a CQD, a distress signal. It came from the Atlantic, 200 or so miles off Greenland. The Pachatea merchant vessel of the Peruvian steamship company had hit an object, maybe whale, maybe iceberg, and was breaking up. The nearest vessel was another South American, Acania, but it was 50 miles away. Galway had picked the call up, so had Le Havre, Malines, Poldhu, and just about every ship between Southampton and New York. 15 minutes after Serge had locked onto the signal, half the radio bugs in Europe had tuned into it as well. The Admiralty put a message out instructing amateurs to stop blocking the air. Serge ignored the order, but lost the signal beneath general interference. The atmospherics were atrocious that night. He listened to the whine and crackle, though, right through till morning, and heard, or thought he heard, among its breaks and flecks, the sound of people treading cold, black water, their hands beating small disturbances into waves that had come to bury them. So we're back to death, right? I think in Italian, ondi is the same, right? Like Wellen in German, for the radio wave and the wave of the sea, right? The idea of drowning in waves.
Es ist ja so in diesem Roman, dass dieser Serge eine Schwester hat, die stirbt.
Mhm.
Und er wird ein Fliegerpilot im Ersten Weltkrieg und dann wird er irgendwie in Ägypten, in Krypten und Pyramiden und Gängen irgendwie immer etwas suchen. Und er versucht, in den Kontakt zu kommen, mit dieser toten Schwester natürlich auch. Und hier endet das Bild ja auch mit diesen möglicherweise Ertrinkenden im Meer.
Ja.
Und er selber ist ja auch eigentlich eine melancholische Figur. Ja. Er ist alleine dort und er sucht den Kontakt mit der Welt. Ja. Über diese Funksignale. Ja. Wie ein einsamer Schreiber, der seine Bibliothek ausweitet und mal auf 100 Magnetofield geht. Und das sind so die bekannten Autoren. Und dann schaltet er noch ein bisschen weiter und kommt mit noch entfernteren Autoren ins Gespräch und schaltet noch weiter. Und dann kommen Signale aus anderen Sprachen, Kulturen. Und was sucht dieser Autor in diesen Signalen? Was suchen wir in den anderen Büchern? Wo suchen wir unser Ich?
I think this idea of a crypt, a crypt is absolutely central. I mean, this whole book is built around the figure of the crypt. In Greek, kryptos means something buried, right? You bury a body so that the soul can come back in the afterlife. You bury information in a technological keychain so that the information can be decrypted at the other end. And so, in a way, everything for Serge is a crypt. Of course, a radio signal is encrypted information encrypted into electricity. A dead sister is literally an encrypted, I mean, she's buried in a crypt, in the family crypt, like Juliet in Romeo and Juliet or whatever, that's the family sepulchre. He ends up in the Egyptian, as an Egyptologist in 1922, the year of the discovery of Tutankhamun, but also of the publication of Ulysses and The Wasteland, right? And Virginia Woolf's The Waves, which is also kind of can be understood as being a radio book. So I think he's seeing not just his relation to his sister, but his relation to history and the world, and his relation, I mean, of course, he's a writer. I mean, effectively, that's what he's doing. He's writing. And this is this form of endless melancholic cryptology, if you like, yeah. Without a final decryptage. Right? Sorry, yeah.
Ich bin einfach sagen wir mal, ich bin in einer etwas seltsamen Stimmung in dieses Gespräch gekommen und das hat noch mit der Lesung von gestern zu tun, als mir plötzlich aufging, dass das Spielerische von Dada und eben auch das Schöne und der Traum vom Surrealismus in der Lesung von Raoul Schott doch mit viel Melancholie, mit viel Verlorenheit durchzogen ist. Und bei ihrem Werk ist es immer ganz stark eben diese Krypta des Todes, das Skriptum, Krypta und so weiter. Es gibt immer etwas Totes. Und dann, wie findet man dann zu diesem Umschlagpunkt, wo plötzlich dieses bedrängende, melancholische, einsame, ja zu einem unglaublich genussvollen, lustvollen Spiel wird. Das ist ja dann plötzlich, kippt das aus diesen bedrängenden, einsamen Szenen in dieses vielleicht postmoderne, aber in diese absolute Freude, okay, wenn es kein Ich gibt, wenn es sich auflöst in der Gruppe, in den Medien, dann können wir jetzt echt mal mit dem Spielen beginnen.
In the psychoanalytic tradition of melancholia in Freud, but also in Lacan, the melancholy is pleasure. You know, the crypt is a place of pleasure. I mean, especially in the incest crypt Serge is very much borrowed from Freud's The Wolfman, L'Uomo Lupo, right? Who also has this incestuous relation with a dead sister. And for Freud, the symptom is a form of pleasure. When you cure someone through psychoanalysis, you make them more rational, but you take away their pleasure, right? And for Lacan as well, jouissance is the symptom that will not go away, and it's always related to death and always related to taboo.
Es gibt ein schönes Buch von einem Schweizer Kunsthistoriker, das heißt Trauer der Vollendung. Da geht es eigentlich eben um die Trauer, wenn alles erreicht worden ist, letztlich schon mit Hegel, und man eben nur noch in diese Repetition hineinkommen kann. Und ich glaube, das Wichtige an der Trauer ist ja, dass man die Trauer nicht verdrängt. Dass man die Trauer nicht verdrängt.
Was verdrängt?
Verdrängung bei Freude, also dass man
verdrängen.
Kann der Übersetzer nicht...
repress,
ja.
But you don't repress
Oder, dass man,
mourning. Okay,
genau.
ja.
Sondern wenn man sie eben nicht verdrängt, sondern durch diese Trauer hindurchgeht,
ja.
Auch in die Melancholie, wo alles zu einer Allegorie des Todes wird. Aber das hat ja auch schon bei Dürer etwas auch Zauberhaftes, etwas Verspieltes. Und dann kann man sozusagen durch diese Trauer der Vollendung, die Trauer der Avantgarde letztlich eben in eine lustvolle Position hineinfinden und das genießen.
Mhm.
Wie würden Sie diesen Genuss beschreiben, den man hat, wenn man dazu steht, dass man nicht wirklich ein Ich hat, sondern Sprache ist, ein Sprachspiel ist, in Sprachspielen zu Hause ist?
at the end of C, Serge basically turns into a radio himself. He has this schizophrenic explosion at the moment of his death, and he becomes every radio message ever since, or he becomes like a radio set through which all the signals of all time are pulsing, like Helen Smith for the Surrealists, maybe, and it just explodes him. But this is a moment of absolute pleasure. I mean, it's an ecstatic, to borrow Baudrillard's idea, it's an ecstasy of communication, and this is a very joyous moment, but it's not survivable. But to take another example, which maybe leads into talking about Satin Island, when I was researching C, I read a book by Lawrence Rickels, the psychoanalyst, called Aberrations of Morning, Writing on German Crypts. And he starts writing about melancholy in the German tradition, and then he starts writing about cargo cults in Polynesia. These people who, during World War II, the Americans, made runways so that aeroplanes could land, and they took out fridges and televisions, and then they went again when the war was over. And the islanders, they were amazed at watching this, and so they built runways, and they made with wooden bats. They did all the the aeroplane. They built control towers, radio towers from just wood, in the hope that the planes would come. And of course they never came. And anthropologists who studied this phenomenon said, actually, it's a very complicated mourning cult. They believe that their dead ancestors are working in factories in the underworld, trying to send them fridges and televisions, but the Americans are diverting the aeroplanes. So if they do the rituals, and you can watch on YouTube very moving footage of hundreds of Polynesian islanders waiting for the aeroplanes and doing these rituals of the bats waving, and it's an elaborate form of mourning, but it's also a political assemblage. It's a way of coming together as a group, and in this kind of ritual way. I mean, it's not without a form of pleasure as well. So I carried that over into my next novel, which kind of involves anthropology and politics, but also in a context of seeing the world as a place that needs to be decrypted,
Sie haben eben von der Avantgarde gesprochen und diesen Gruppen der Organisation, wie Sie selber eine avantgardistische, nekronautische Sekte, Society gegründet haben und geleitet haben. Und all diese Gruppen sind ja zerfallen. Am Schluss bleibt dann André Breton ein bisschen alleine, und wir haben es mit den Situationisten gesehen. Am Schluss bleibt Guy Debord alleine.
He expelled everyone, and then when there was no one left to expel, he shot himself.
Und Guy Debord hat darüber lamentiert, alles, was man macht, wird von der Gesellschaft des Spektakels aufgesogen. Die surrealistischen Spiele werden in Werbeplakate umgesetzt, die dadaistischen Plakate werden ebenfalls übernommen. Man darf gar nichts mehr machen, man darf keine Kunst mehr machen, man darf nur noch zu Hause sitzen, ganz einsam mit einem Kriegsspiel, was man selber erfindet. Und Sie haben das natürlich genau studiert, also eben diese Frage, dass alles immer sofort aufgesogen wird von der Gesellschaft des Spektakels.
Ja.
Aber auch hier ist es wieder eine Kippfigur bei Ihnen, also Sie genießen das auch, diese Absurdität, dass die Errungenschaften der Avantgarde, die gegen das Kapital, gegen den Profit, gegen die Politik entworfen wurden, letztlich genau vom Kapital, der Politik und dem Profit wieder appropriiert werden. Also auch das ist genau dieselbe Umkehr, Kippfigur von der Trauer in die spielvolle Lust.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think this is a really, I think the key concept from situationism that we're homing in on here is Guy Debord's notion of recuperation, that no matter how radical and revolutionary a gesture or an idea is, the more radical even it will be recuperated by the very system that it threatens, that it attacks. So as you say, the radical language of surrealism becomes advertising, the cut-up techniques of William Burroughs, the writings of a Kathy Acker or someone's punk sensibility just becomes kind of MTV, and see how old I am. I'm already thinking about something 20 years old. So, but I think this is a very interesting process, and I looked at this in Staten Island. The protagonist is a corporate anthropologist. He's an anthropologist who works for a company, like more than 50% of anthropology graduates now do. He works for a company, but so using avant-garde, the history of Levi-Strauss and structuralism and so on, to kind of decode consumer habits to produce reports and dossiers for companies, governments, etc. And but he still harbors fantasies of somehow, putting bad information and destroying the system. And then he fantasizes about starting a new Baader-Meinhof group or being like Patty Hearst in America. But then as soon as he thinks about Baader-Meinhof, he thinks, oh, they wore such good sunglasses. I could, so he's already thinking in terms of fashion. But I think this playback, this feedback loop between opposition and recuperation is very interesting. And I think what persists is still the importance of poetry. Effectively, he's also a form of writer, and what he's doing is putting meaning in the world, even in this problematic, fraught manner.
Sollte ja den großen Bericht schreiben, das Buch, was schon Mallarmé vorgeschwebt hat, also die Welt besteht, in einem Buch zu enden.
But this will be a corporate, this will be a government report, like what Perec had to write. His first novel was commissioned as a government report. So, but he never writes. My character never writes this book. He just. Yeah.
Aber Ihre Bücher kreisen ja immer genau um so etwas, also diese abwesende Erinnerung in 8,5 Millionen. Was ist eigentlich passiert? Führt dann zu einem Terroranschlag möglicherweise. Hier sollte ein eben Bericht geschrieben werden für diese Firma, und hier auch in K ist auch eine Suche nach etwas, und im neuesten Buch, der Dreh der Inkarnation, geht es um den Dreh eines Filmskripts, der auch irgendwie plötzlich so ins Nichts hinausläuft.
I'm very interested in the unfinished project.
Weshalb gehen Sie immer in dieses Nicht-Existente, in das Abwesende von Raoul Schrott hinein?
Yes.
Was zieht Sie dorthin?
I'm very interested not in finitude, not in the product, but in the Zukunft, in the to come. Mallarmé's book is always to come. Democracy for Derrida is always to come. Everything is, even if you read Ulysses, the book you're reading is not the book that's in the book. It's or in Proust, it's the same. He ends by imagining the book that will be written, which is not the same as the book you have in your hands. So I like this idea of culture as an eternally unfinished project, right? I think that excites me, whatever.
Und denken Sie dann, dass das Buch sich im Kopf des Lesers zu Ende schreibt, oder dass es eben, wie Blanchot sagen würde, ein unendliches Gespräch ist, die Literatur immer zwischen Leser und Autor, aber auch zwischen den Büchern, dass die Bücher miteinander sozusagen endlos funken. Hier rund um den Monte Verita funken sie auch. Und wenn wir jetzt, wie Raoul Schrott gesagt haben, nur noch präsent wären, nur noch da sitzen, ohne Sprache im Lagerkoller, würden die Bücher weiter miteinander sprechen?
It's an ongoing entretien infini, like Blanchot says. It's an infinite conversation that never comes to its conclusion. It's always agitated and problematic and full of crypts and holes.
Aber dann können Sie auch letztlich diesem Zugriff eben des Kapitals auf die Errungenschaften der Avantgarde doch immer wieder entgehen. Haben Sie das Gefühl, man kann entrinnen, es gibt einen Ausweg ins Offene?
I didn't understand that.
Denken Sie denn, dass man den Appropriationsbestrebungen eben von Kapital, Werbung und Profit letztlich doch entfliehen kann?
No, I don't think you can move outside of the matrix, but I think in a sense that's a reactionary fantasy to want to go and be like Thoreau or it's the Unabomber fantasy to go and live in a hut with outside the grid. I think we are inside, we are in language, we are in history, we are in networks of power, and our political agency as well as our artistic agency begins when we recognize this and recognize that the challenge is to find strategies of dérivement, ways of moving through these symbolic orders and of, rather than some fantasy of sovereign kind of escape. Shall I read a passage from Staten Island? It's very much about recuperation.
Tell us how he's escaping.
Well, this is the thing. He's not escaping. Well, yeah, maybe he's escaping. So this is the hero is called U after Ulrich in Musel, but just U, the letter U. And he's here. He talks about how he grew up worshipping Claude Lévi-Strauss, the great structuralist anthropologist, and how he uses his work for his dossiers. Okay, 4.1 on Lévi-Strauss. He was my hero. He would roam around the world twice, first slowly, physically, by boat and train and donkey, then all over again on fast track, as writing his findings up, he zapped from continent to continent, culture to culture, traveling through wormholes of association until he'd remade the entire globe into a collage of recurring colors, smells, and patterns especially. The painted patterning on tribesmen's bodies, the layout concentric or congruent or concyclic of village huts, the symmetry or asymmetry of caste systems, their transgenerational rhythms of exogamy and endogamy. He saw these all as co-related parts of a larger systems lying behind not just a single tribe, but also the larger one of all humanity. If we had some kind of grid that we could lay across it all, he reasoned, we could establish a grand pattern of equivalences. Describing sunsets, he saw spun webs of lit-up vapor, a whole architecture of reflective strands that both revealed and hid the source that lay behind them. Even landscape seemed to him to withhold in its layers and strata some kind of infrastructural master meaning, of which any one layer was a partial, distorted transposition. This stuff bewitched me. Master meaning, concealed revealment. I spent my 20s wanting to be Lévi-Strauss, which is ironic since he spent most of his life wanting to be somebody or something else, a philosopher, say, or novelist, or poet. 4.2, also ironic, the very first brief I was given when I started working at the company. I was, Tapio informed me, to compile a dossier on jeans. The client was Levi's, or to give the company its full name, Levi Strauss. A little research unearthed more than just coincidence behind the nomenclatural overlap. The jeans maker, like the anthropologist, had been an Ashkenazi Jew. Both, leaving Europe under vague or not so vague threat, had turned to the Americas and built their fame on what they did there. Levi No-Strauss was German, but the fabric he sold came, like Lévi-Strauss, from France, from Nîmes, down in the south. Serge de Nîmes, denim. Nîmes serge has unique fading and dyeing properties. I spent my first 3 weeks of gainful employment interviewing teenagers, midlife crisis-riven men, and garment workers, assessing the subtle code spectrum of turn-ups, buttons, zippers, creases, generally breaking down how jeans, and Levi-Strauss ones in particular, connoted. I got really into creases. Jeans crease in all kinds of interesting ways: honeycomb, whisker, train track, stack. I catalogued no fewer than 17 different crease types, each of which has slightly different innuendos. To frame these, that is, to provide a framework for explaining to the client what these crease types truly and profoundly meant, I stole a concept from the French philosopher Gilles Deleuze. For him, le pli, or fold, describes the way we swallow the exterior world, invert it, and then flip it back outwards again, and in so doing form our own identity. I took out all the revolutionary shit. Deleuze was a lefty. And I didn't credit Deleuze either. Big retail companies don't want to hear about such characters. I did the same thing with another French philosopher, Alain Badiou. I recycled his notion of a rip, a sudden temporal rupture, and applied it naturally to tears worn in jeans, which I presented as the birth scars of their wearer's singularity, testaments to the individual's break with general history, to the successful institution of a personal time. I dropped the radical baggage from that too. Badiou is virtually Maoist. This pretty much set up the protocol I would employ in my work for the company from then on, feeding avant-garde theory almost always from the left side of the spectrum back into the corporate machine. The machine could swallow everything, incorporate it seamlessly like a giant loom that reweaves all fabric, no matter how recalcitrant and jarring its raw form, into what my hero would have called a master pattern, or if not that, then maybe just the pattern of the master. 4.3, le pli. While my supposed business, my official function as a corporate ethnographer was to garner meaning from all types of situation, to extract it like a physicist distilling some pure, unadulterated essence out of common mongrel compounds, or a miner drawing gold ore from deep within the earth's bowels, I sometimes allowed to think that in fact things were precisely the other way round, that my job was to put meaning in the world, not take it from it. Divining for the benefit of a breakfast cereal manufacturer the social or symbolic role of breakfast, what fasting represents, the significance of breaking it. Establishing for them some of the primary axes shaping the way in which the practice of living is or might be carried out, and watching the manufacturer then feed that information back into their product and its packaging as they upgraded and refined these. I understood the end result to be not simply better tasting cereal or bigger profits for the manufacturer, but rather meaning, amplified and sharpened for the millions of risers lifting cereal boxes over breakfast tables, tipping out and ingesting their contents. Helping a city council who were thinking of creating parks and plazas but had yet to understand the ethnographic logic driving such an act, laying out for them the history of public as opposed to private space, making them understand what these zones fundamentally embody, what's at play in them from a political and structural and sacred point of view, and doing this in such a way that this whole history is then injected back into the squares, sports fields, and playgrounds millions of citizens will then inhabit. Same thing. Down in my office, stirred and lulled by ventilation, I would picture myself as some kind of nocturnal worker, like those men who go out and repair the roads, or check the points and switches on the railway tracks, or carry out a range of covert tasks that go unnoticed by the populace at large, but on which the latter's well-being, even survival, is dependent. While the city sleeps, bakers are baking bread in night kitchens, milkmen are loading crates onto their floats, and rivermen are dredging riverbeds or checking water levels, while other men in buildings with nondescript exteriors track storm surges and spring and neap tides on their screens and activate the flood defenses when this becomes necessary. When the populace at large wakes up, they just see the milk there on their doorstep and the fresh bread in the shop down the street, and the street itself still there, unflooded, untsunamied from existence, and they take it all for granted, where in fact these men have put the milk and bread there, and have even in deploying the flood defenses put the city there as well, put it back there every time they deploy them. That's what I was doing too, I told myself. The world functioned each day because I had put meaning back into it the day before. You didn't notice that I put it there because it was there. But if I'd stopped, you'd soon have known it.
So, da sind wir schon sehr nah bei Nietzsche, der Herrn Burkhardt geschrieben hat. Er wäre ja auch gern Basler Professor geblieben, aber er konnte die Schöpfung der Welt nicht unterlassen. Also, wenn Sie jetzt letzte Nacht nicht über den Monte Verita nachgedacht hätten, dann gäbe es ihn jetzt nicht mehr. Sie haben uns alle hingestellt. Also jetzt möchten wir es aber umdrehen. Ich bin ja sozusagen die Verkörperung der Werbeträger, jetzt Eventi Letterari Monte Verita. Ich bin jetzt sozusagen in der Hierarchie dieser Medienmaschine irgendwo ein bisschen weiter oben. Jetzt machen Sie mal ein gutes Programm, wie wir mit den Mitteln der postmodernen Avantgarde sozusagen jetzt alles umdrehen und uns auf dem Markt verkaufen. Machen Sie mir jetzt ganz schnell ein 5-Punkte-Programm. Sie verkaufen Levi-Strauss Jeans und Monte Verita.
I didn't quite understand the formulation.
I put you now in the situation of this guy, and you are working now for our association. So now you have to say 5 points how we can sell Monte Verita.
How you can sell?
Yeah.
I don't know what he'd advise. He'd probably come here and I don't know what he'd do. He'd have some crisis and take LSD or something and then wander away. and then write some bullshit about Alain Badiou and right? and you'd love it and you'd pay him loads of money for it and say it was genius. This is what he does in the book. He makes up stuff, and the companies say this is absolutely brilliant, and he thinks, but I just made it up. I stole it, and says this. I can't answer the question, but I like the idea. It's in Shelley says poets are the unacknowledged administrators of the world, and you get the same thought in the Surrealists very much that the poet is the one who makes the world function by putting the meaning there.
Wir können jetzt die dritte Stelle nicht vorlesen, wo Sie sozusagen eine Ölkatastrophe herbeifantasieren und den Applaus der ganzen Mitarbeiter einer Versicherung oder so dann ernten für diese wunderbare katastrophische Vorstellung. Aber dieses Konzept eigentlich des Formlosen haben wir dann von Georges Bataille als Reaktion eben auch auf den Surrealismus, wo er schon früh sah, 1929, dass der Surrealismus natürlich in die Galerien den Weg finden wird und dass das, was uns am meisten beschäftigen sollte im Leben, die Auflösung, der Tod, die Spucke, das Öl, das Unförmige ist, dass man aber dann doch wieder in der Kunst zu einer Form macht. Ja. Es ist immer diese seltsame Dialektik von Unform das Hauptthema. Wir haben es auch bei Michael Lenz gehört, der Tod des Bruders. Es geht immer um dieses Verschwinden, die Auflösung aller Formen und dann eben die Gegenbewegung, aus dem Ungeformten eine Form zu machen.
Yeah. So one of the ongoing preoccupations of my anti-hero is with oil. He's seen on the television an oil catastrophe. Oil is moving towards the white, snowy landscapes, and he thinks of ink moving towards white paper. Melancholy is from melachole, it means black liquid, right? Melancholia was originally thought of as a material, even by Dürer, a material affliction, black liquid, it's like ink. And as you mentioned Bataille, I think this is another really important legacy or something that afterlife of surrealism, the group within the surrealists who were kind of expelled and split and became the document group. So Bataille, Lechis, Roger Caillois, these people. And they saw Breton and surrealism as it was a Hegelian, as an idealist, like surrealism. It was all about, Hegel was a Christian theologian, right? For him, everything had to manifest as spirit, as ideal kind of synthesis of the world had to turn into its own idea. And Breton took this, the idea that there's a higher manifestation of reality, surrealism. Bataille and the document group went in the exact opposite direction. They said we should go down, down, down into the base materialism. And they had this central idea, as you say, of l'informe, the formless, which was like the opposite of ideas. It was the world as spit or a spider, something that won't be contained within the frock coat of philosophy. I know Merlin Sheldrake on the first night was talking about mushrooms like this. They don't fit the category. Bataille talks about déclasser. The formless is a form of declassifying, like demoting, but also déclasser, to liberate from the kind of taxonomic categories. So the formless, yes. To say that the world is formless, Bataille says, is to say that it resembles nothing. It's like spit. And art, rather than to kind of contain the world within language or literature, it should, and translate it into thought, it should let matter, right? Let the messiness of what is kind of flow. And so in Satin Island, my hero is, he gives a catastrophic TED talk, these kind of evangelical idiot kind of 15-minute formats, and he gives a really bad one that nobody likes, and in the sauna in the hotel afterwards, he goes in and everyone goes away into the smoke because they don't want to talk to him. And then he imagines this great talk he would give about the beauty of oil, of spilling oil. I mean, do you want me to?
Wir haben wahrscheinlich nicht mehr die Zeit, um die Stelle zu lesen, aber sie ist ja im Handout. Andererseits, eben um in diesen Zustand zu kommen, dass man die Welt als Spucke, als Qualle, als Gedärm wahrnehmen kann, da zitieren Sie ausgerechnet James Joyce und Ulysses.
Absolutely,
ich meine, das ist aber dann doch ein recht großer Aufwand. Ein großer Aufwand.
Aufwand?
He has to do, he has a lot of costs of interpretation and doing writing to get into this mood of really being a spit. So, das ist auch dann ein riesiger pyramidaler Turm von Wissen, um ins Nichtwissen zu kommen.
Yeah, absolutely. Ulysses, the great Swiss novel, or the greatest novel ever, which was written in Switzerland, it's obsessed with the formless. I mean, Joyce hadn't read Bataille, obviously, but there's a very similar sensibility. It's all about excess, the excessiveness of water, blood. I mean, the sewage systems of Dublin are overflowing. There is shit all over the beach, and the poet walks around the beach looking at garbage, and he sees in the garbage the encrypted tokens of all of history and all of language. He says, these heavy sands are language, tide and wind have silted here, heavy with the past. So it's a really, base materialist book, and but as you say, it's incredibly carefully constructed. But it's constructed, I mean, we could imagine almost like one of the main recurrent themes in Ulysses is the water and sewage system of Dublin, which Joyce studied very, very carefully. There's one scene where a character turns on the tap, and Joyce tells you exactly how many meters and who owns which bit of the pipeline that the water has come down, and which sources and which filtration stations. But the system is leaking, right? There's too much water, too much shit, too much history, and it overflows. And this is the jouissance, this is the pleasure, the melancholic pleasure of Ulysses, which is a book also obsessed with death and mourning and melancholia, but it's about this excessive overflow of what is, of Dasein, and this is why it's such a fantastic book and will never be contained in a in a frock coat, as Bataille would say. It will always be too much for us.
Das war vielleicht ein recht gutes Schlusswort für diese etwas melancholisch und gefärbte Unterhaltung über Ihre lustvoll spielenden Bücher, aber die eben schon natürlich eben von dieser Melancholie ausgehen, dass alles schon einmal gemacht wurde. Man kann nichts Neues erfinden, aber man kann neu spielen und natürlich auch angetrieben wird von dieser Vorstellung, dass Literatur letztlich etwas Böses ist im Sinne von Partei. Es ist eigentlich ein Fehler im System und selbst ein Buch wie Ulysses führt eigentlich in Zustände, die die Gesellschaft normalerweise verdrängen will, die wir nicht wahrhaben wollen. Und um in diese Zustände zu geraten, genügt es ja nicht, auf den Boden zu spucken, sondern man muss extrem komplexe Kunstwerke machen, die uns dazu verführen, wie bei Ihren Werken, in dieses offene End zu kommen, nicht mehr weiter zu wissen, ins weiße Rauschen, in den Nebel. Es ist wunderbar, was für Bücher Sie ausspucken. Vielen Dank.
Danke. Thank you.
Ja.